Nathan said that we're dressed a little bit casually today. Today is the first time since he was born that Stephen has come to worship without a necktie on. So he's feeling a little bit exposed this morning. So you did a great job anyway, Stephen. So we're grateful. Yes, grateful for that. So let me ask you a question. If a young man was proposing to a girl that he loves, don't you think it would work out better if she would notice that that's what he's doing? I have a story to tell you. In the spring of 1998, I had been dating a young lady by the name of Allison Harper. We'd been dating a while, and I knew pretty much from the time that we had started dating seriously in the fall before that I was going to ask her to marry me. So the question became, for me, in my mind, how exactly to pull that off. I wanted it to be deep and meaningful. Allison will tell you I'm kind of a perfectionist when it comes to those kinds of things. Allison was a student at Texas A&M University. I was working at Baylor. I thought about asking her down in College Station, but that didn't seem to fit. I thought about asking her up in Waco where I live. That didn't seem to work either. Allison's parents lived in Austin, and we had spent quite a bit of our dating experience in Austin. But that didn't seem like the right place. On the weekend that I was going to ask her to marry me, she was actually coming up to Waco to meet me for us to drive up to Oklahoma. I thought about doing it up there with my family. All those things were okay ideas, but none of them seemed perfect. Well, it just so happens that there was this little chapel on a hill about halfway in between College Station, Texas, and Waco, Texas. And I thought to myself, if I could figure out some way to get Allison to that chapel without her knowing what was going on, that would be the perfect place for me to ask her to marry me. You know, in a church, symbolically halfway in between us. Of course, the challenge was, how was I going to make that work? So I came up with this idea. Signs. Big ones. I made 3 signs, about 8 feet across, about 4 feet high, and I thought to myself, if I can just get down there on the day when she's going to be driving up to Waco to meet me and get those in the ground alongside the road, then she'll see her name. She will take that right turn down to that chapel, and I'll be in there ready to ask her to marry me. Sounds like a great plan, doesn't it? So the day came, and I had done a number of things to kind of get ready for it. I had a Bible engraved with her married name on it. People have told me since then I was a little bit overconfident in that, but, it worked out. I bought a rose for her, and, of course, I had the ring. But on the day that I was going to meet her, an unexpected appointment showed up on my calendar. I was the director of prospective student services for Truett Seminary, so one of my responsibilities was to give tours to prospective students. Well, on that particular Friday morning, somebody that was not on my calendar showed up to get a tour. So I did what I could to give a tour, but I was running a little bit late. In fact, I was running a lot late. And I still had to stop by the florist, and I still had to stop by the bookstore to pick up the Bible. So by the time I had gotten all that done, I was panicking. I wasn't sure I was going to get there on time. And so I did what you do when you're going to be late for something and you have to drive to get there. I was driving, just a little bit short of the speed of light on my way south towards Marlin, Texas, when I drove over a hill, and wouldn't you know it, just on the other side of the hill was a Texas state trooper. I was going so fast, I didn't even wonder what was going to happen next. I just pulled over to the side of the road. Now, it's probably not a good idea if you are pulled over by a state trooper to get out of your car and run toward them while you're trying to get something out of your pocket, which is what I did, because I was trying to get the ring out of my pocket. Because I figured if I could show them the ring, then maybe they'd let me off the hook and let me get moving again. Not thinking to myself, normally people that would do this might get gunned down in a blaze of glory. Thankfully, that is not what happened on that day. I got the ring out of my pocket. And not only that, there wasn't just one state trooper in the car, but 2. And one of them, thank the Lord, was a female officer. I've got a shot, I thought to myself. And so I blurted out the whole story. Officers, I'm so sorry that I'm going so fast, but I'm trying to get down to Marlin, Texas to get these signs in the ground because I'm going to ask this girl who's a student at College Station to marry me. I'm so sorry. Can you forgive me? Can you let me go? And the male officer is doing everything he can to keep a straight face, but the female officer just starts laughing as soon as I start talking. All right, they say, slow down. We'll let you go. That's what I'll do. I promise, officers, I will slow down. And I was thinking to myself, tomorrow. Got back in the car, got out of their sight, sped back up, was driving south. Thankfully, I didn't see Allison's car, so I still think I'm okay. I get down there to where that road is that takes a right turn about a quarter mile up the hill to the chapel. I put the first sign in the ground. A little bit further, I put another sign in the ground. A little bit further, a third sign in the ground. The first sign says, Allison Harper, pay attention. That's the first big sign. The second sign says, Allison Harper, you're almost there. And the third sign says, Allison Harper, turn right here. Got them all on the ground. I turned around. I drove back into the chapel. Now, this was the only part of the plan that I was worried about because I had to go in the chapel and set everything up. I had written a letter to her, put it on a poster board with her name on it. I had a Bible. I put the ring inside the Bible. I put the rose inside the Bible at 1 Corinthians 13. I put them down on the altar, and the plan was for her to come in, find the letter, read the letter, go down to the front of the altar where I would come in like Romeo and Prince Charming combined with a little bit of Jesus on the side, and I would ask this girl to marry me, and she would say yes. I was in the chapel for about 2 minutes, and then I made my way back out to the front, and I stood on the front steps watching for her car. 5 minutes passes. No Allison. 10 minutes passes. No Allison. Now, Allison, I'm the one who tends to be late in our family. Allison tends to be on time. So with everything that had gone on, she really should have been there about the time that I got there. 20 minutes pass and no Allison. So I figured, you know what? In that 2 minutes of time when I was inside the chapel, she has driven by and she has missed the signs. Now, this was a while ago, so this is in the day before everybody had cell phones. So I thought to myself, okay, I'll get back in my car and I'll drive south towards the nearest town, which is only a couple of miles away, and I'll call and I'll see if I can get her. And so that's what I did. I'm driving south, just thinking in my mind, maybe, just maybe, she's still going to come. I hadn't gone maybe a half mile when I saw her car coming towards me. All right, this is still going to work, I think. I'll make a U-turn. I'll follow her in behind her. I'll follow in behind her. She'll come in. I'll sneak in the back of the chapel, and I'll still be able to execute my plan perfectly. So that's what I did. I went down. I maybe had to drive another quarter mile down past her to get a U-turn. I kind of lost sight of her. I took that right turn. I pulled into the parking lot of the chapel, and guess what? She had missed the signs. So now she's on the road to Waco going 60 miles an hour, and I've got to catch up to her. You thought I was driving fast the first time. So I do everything I can to catch up to her and to get right up next to her car. Finally, on the outskirts of Waco, I pull my car right up next to her with a big old romantic grin on my face. And do you know what the reaction of the woman that I'm about to ask to marry me is? She screams. Because she doesn't know who this strange guy is that's just smiling at her for no reason for the first few seconds. Finally, she realizes, oh, yeah, I date that guy, so maybe I don't have to be afraid. I feed her some lame story about having to go pick up this person as a part of my job at Truett Seminary, and I ask her to get in the car with me, to leave her car there. She does. We're driving south, and all the time she has this kind of strange expression on her face. She's wondering what's going on, wondering why I'm insisting that she's going to go with me to go pick up this person, the story that I made up completely on the spur of the moment. And just before we're going to turn left to go to this chapel, because we're coming from the north, Allison says, you know what? I tell you what, rather than me go with you to pick up that guy, why don't you just drop me off at that antique store right there, just a couple of blocks down? Now, that's important. Remember that detail. I just pretend like I don't hear her, and I turn off, oh, you meant now. We'll go to that antique store later. I pull into the chapel. I say, you know what? We've talked about going to this chapel. We've talked about it for years, how beautiful it is. Why don't we've got about 10 minutes. Why don't we step inside real quick and see what it looks like? So she buys it. We go inside. And then finally, she walks in. She sees the poster with her name on it, a letter. And finally, the light bulb comes on that something is taking place here. I leave her there to read the letter, and I go down to the front of the altar. By the way, should I mention, the entire time that I'm chasing her on the way to Waco, I left the engagement ring in the Bible. So that little detail, marinate on that for a second. She makes her way down to the altar. She finds me sitting down there. I ask her to marry me. She says yes, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it didn't happen because she saw the signs. I want to point that out to you. So let me ask you, have you ever missed out on something important because you weren't paying attention? Show of hands. Anybody? Quite a few. So Allison, you're not the only one. I read this week about a moment in the life of Denzel Washington, the year that he was nominated for an Oscar for his role in the movie The Hurricane. He had just flown from L.A. back to New York. It was a little jet lagged, and so that morning when all of the other actors are watching their TV screens with rapt attention to see if their names are going to be called, Denzel Washington had no clue because he slept right through it. A friend of mine named Steve was in Washington, D.C. once for a meeting. He was sitting at a Starbucks drinking his coffee and checking his email on his phone when his buddy came back from the bathroom and asked him if he had spoken to Senator Marco Rubio. "What are you talking about?" Steve said. "Well," said his buddy, "he walked right past you." Steve, however, had been looking at his phone and had completely missed it. It's easy to get distracted in this day and age in which we live. Easy to miss out on something important because we're engrossed in something that we think is urgent. You and I live in a busy, frantic time in history where 1,000 things compete for our attention. But in the 12th chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus gives his followers some good advice. Be prepared, Jesus says. Like a Boy Scout leader, Jesus wants his followers to always be on the lookout, always be ready. Because according to Jesus, you never know when he and his kingdom might begin to appear. You know what the greatest problem in our world today is? The greatest problem in our world today is not war or violence, although those are certainly problems. The greatest problem in our world today isn't the abuse of human sexuality, although the way it's abused in American culture certainly makes it a big problem. The greatest problem in our world today isn't materialism or poverty or divorce or abortion or whatever the long list of problems the public might talk about. The greatest problem in our world today is that we have lost sight of God. As strange as it sounds, I think the church might have even unwittingly made that problem worse, not better. Most of us here in this room were raised in a church culture. Most of you have heard me say this before, but in a highly religious culture like ours used to be, God was easy to find. Go to church, you'll find Him. Read your Bible, you'll find Him. Have your quiet time, you'll find Him. And while those are great places to encounter God, they just happen to leave out about 99% of the rest of our lives. While a lot of good came from the way that the church used to be so central to our culture, the problem it created is that it convinced us to look for God only within the context of our religiosity. But if that's the only place that we're looking for Him, then we're not going to spot Him very often. So instead, Jesus asks us to be ready, to be on the lookout. What we have to learn to do is to spot Jesus wherever He might be. In our families, in our email, at the hospital, in the car, at mealtimes, in the words of a stranger that we've never met, and in the actions of people who get on our nerves every day. One of my favorite Christian writers, a man by the name of Frederick Buechner, says, "There is no event so commonplace, but that God is not present within it, always hidden, but always leaving you room to recognize Him or not. Because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself is grace." Of course, all of that assumes something. Even those of us who miss God because we're not looking in the right place are still looking for God. But another and perhaps bigger part of our problem is that far too often we're not looking at all. It is interesting, isn't it, that in Luke's gospel, Jesus gives two pieces of advice back to back. First, Jesus says, don't be too worried about material stuff. Instead, worry about spiritual stuff. And then after he gives that advice, then Jesus says, keep watching. Be ready. Those two pieces of advice, it seems, are interrelated. On the day that Allison and I got engaged, she made a confession to me a little later that afternoon. With a sheepish look on her face, she told me that the reason that she probably missed the signs was that at that exact same place on the road was that antique shop. And on the front porch of that antique shop were some chairs that she had seen multiple times driving from College Station to Waco. So those big garish signs never caught her attention because those lovely chairs did. I think she might tell you that the only thing that she would change about the day that we got engaged is that in addition to the ring I gave her, she'd like to know how much those chairs cost. All kidding aside, there are a million things that can distract us from Christ and His kingdom. Money can distract us, either in the effort it takes to have as much of it as our friends do, or in the fear and frustration we feel in not having that much. Work can distract us, either in the desires we feel to prove ourselves worthy of love and respect by our efforts, or in the inadequacy we experience when we feel incapable of doing so. Relationships can distract us when we begin to see love not as an opportunity but as a burden, or when we feel resentment that others are not loving us as well as we think we deserve. Hobbies can distract us when we begin to see the gifts that God gives us, like a day on the boat or a night at the ball game, as more important than the giver himself. When we begin to believe somehow that these small, temporary joys of life are capable of bringing us deep, abiding joy. Politics can distract us in almost exactly the same way. Whenever we think that a candidate or a political party has the ultimate answers, that the fate of the world rests on the outcome of one election rather than in trusting in Christ and His kingdom, it is very easy for us to substitute a political kingdom for an eternal one. But here's the subtle challenge for us as Christians. Our challenge isn't to reject all of those things as worthless. Because ultimately, it is not money or work or our relationships. It is not our hobbies nor our politics that are the problem. Those are not evil things to be rejected. We just have to remember that they are a means unto an end, not an end in and of themselves. Jesus doesn't want us to quit our jobs or give up our hobbies. Instead, Jesus wants us to look for Him in the midst of such places because it is in such places where He and His kingdom may come if we will but pay close attention. And if that sounds challenging, if that sounds like a skill that will be difficult for you to develop, well, what I would say to you is don't worry. Because if you need help spotting Christ and His kingdom, then the good news is that Jesus has given us at least one way in which spotting Him has been made easy and straightforward. If you want to up your game when it comes to spotting Jesus, then my advice to you is to start by loving your neighbors. As a church, we're venturing into this year-long mission trip. This first year of Love Does, called KOG to IOM. And teaching kids to read, and feeding the hungry, in sheltering the homeless and welcoming the strangers and in offering new life to people in prison, here's what happens. Not only do we help others, and if we do those things, we certainly will help others. If we do those things, we certainly will bring healing where there is now brokenness. But not only does that happen, because when we start to get good at spotting Jesus and his kingdom and being a part of it, then we are healed too. Then we experience the fullness of his kingdom. And that is why Jesus says, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes, whenever that might be. Truly, I tell you, and this ought to blow our minds, he will dress himself to serve us. And we will be invited to recline at the table, and he will come and wait on us. Don't let those just be words on a page. Don't let the opportunity that represents to have that kind of intimate, life-changing encounter with God and his kingdom fly right by you. God loved us so much that he sent his only Son. What, to lord over us? No, to die for us on a cross, to wash our feet, to help us become all that God intended for us to be. And if you can find something more worthwhile than that, I urge you to invest your life in it. But you won't. Because there is nothing more worthwhile. Allison said yes that day 18 years ago. Thank God. Because if I'm honest, I have to tell you that even though she missed the signs on that day, I'm probably the one that is far more easily distracted. Thankfully, she doesn't tend to hold that against me. She just keeps loving and serving. The same is true for you. Whether you've been paying attention, close enough attention or not in the past, what Jesus has for us today and in the coming days isn't so much a warning, but an opportunity. Watch out. Be prepared. For Christ is coming along with his kingdom, and if we will just pay attention, amazing things will happen. Will you pray with me? Father, help us to realize the opportunity that you give us to follow Jesus. It's more than just a religious obligation, but an opportunity to experience what life was created to be in all its joy and abundance and fullness for now and eternity. That means that we have to take off our worldly set of lenses, God, and put on a kingdom set. Help us to do that too, so that we may experience what it means to be a part of your kingdom. It's in Jesus' name we pray.